The European Union is falling apart, and it's good for Africa and global peace. The European Summit on March 6, 2025, marks a turning point. The European Union, once perceived as a unified bloc behind Ukraine, is now showing deep cracks. Slovakia, under the leadership of Robert Fico, has shattered the consensus by refusing to fund the war, and demanding an immediate ceasefire, much to the dismay of Zelensky and a number of European leaders. Regarding yesterday's Trump-Zelensky meeting. 1. Slovakia will not support Ukraine either financially or militarily to enable it to continue the war. If others choose to do so, we will respect that. 2. Slovakia has reservations about the unrealistic strategy of peace through strength, which is only intended to serve as a justification for continuing the war in Ukraine. Ukraine will never be strong enough to negotiate from a position of military power. 3. For the conclusions of the European Union Summit on Thursday, March 6, 2025, Slovakia proposes, among other things, the necessity of an immediate ceasefire, regardless of the moment a final peace agreement is reached, which President Zelensky and a large number of European Union member states reject. 4. Slovakia demands that the conclusions explicitly include a requirement to reopen the transit of gas through Ukraine to Slovakia and Western Europe. The situation is absurd. Gas from the east to the west is not flowing, yet Ukraine is worsening the situation in Europe by taking European gas. This is Russian gas, for which it pays, thereby funding Russia's military needs. It is impossible to ensure Europe's competitiveness if the supply of Russian gas through Ukraine is not restored. The assistance that the European Union and Slovakia provide to Ukraine in various forms cannot be a one-way ticket. 5. If the summit does not respect that there are other opinions besides simply continuing the war, the European Council may not be able to agree on conclusions regarding Ukraine on Thursday. 6. Slovakia respects the need to increase Europe's defense capabilities. Signed Robert Fico. This growing rift within the European Union is not just an internal crisis. It is a historic opportunity for Africa and for global peace. Since the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, the European Union has blindly followed Washington's directives. Financing the war with billions, arming Kiev without a clear diplomatic strategy, and sacrificing European economies on the altar of a war that does not directly concern them. But today, some countries are beginning to realize the absurdity of this stance. Slovakia, by opposing unconditional support for Ukraine, raises a fundamental question. How long will Europe continue its economic self-destruction for a country that is not even an European Union member? Slovakia's position exposes the growing discontent across the continent. With soaring inflation, an energy crisis, and widespread public fatigue over an unwinnable war, several European states are beginning to question the warmongering policies imposed by Brussels and Washington. One of the most explosive points of the summit is Slovakia's demand for an immediate ceasefire. Contrary to the dominant narrative, where any negotiation is seen as a sign of weakness, Robert Fico highlights a simple truth. No war ever ends without dialogue. Yet, Zelensky and some European leaders categorically reject this idea, preferring to prolong the conflict even if it plunges Europe into an unprecedented crisis. This rejection once again proves that the goal of some is not peace but the long-term weakening of Russia, even at the cost of sacrificing European citizens. This is a strategy dictated by Washington, which watches Europe's economic collapse from a distance, while raking in massive profits from shale gas sales and arms exports. This fracture within the European Union is excellent news for Africa. Why? Because it weakens a bloc that has imposed its economic and political dictates on African nations for decades. With a divided and economically strained European Union, Brussels' ability to enforce neo-colonial policies in Africa is diminishing. The obsession with Ukraine diverts Europe's resources and attention, allowing African nations more room to negotiate alternative partnerships, particularly with Russia, China, and other emerging powers. By destabilizing itself, Europe will no longer have the means to intervene as aggressively on the African continent. France, for example, already struggling in the Sahel, will suffer even more from the collapse of the European project, accelerating the end of its influence. The war in Ukraine has fast-tracked the emergence of a multipolar world, where Africa is no longer just a playground for Western powers. With a weakened Europe, African nations can now assert their sovereignty, negotiate alliances on equal terms, and reject the economic dictates previously imposed by Brussels. One of the summit's most revealing points is the energy issue. Slovakia is demanding the restoration of Russian gas transit through Ukraine, exposing the European Union's total hypocrisy. On one hand, Europe claims to sanction Russia, but on the other, it remains dependent on its gas. This glaring contradiction proves that the European Union has never had a real strategy, only blind submission to American interests. This internal chaos is the logical consequence of an ill-conceived policy. By refusing to adopt a pragmatic stance on Ukraine, Europe has condemned itself to deep divisions and accelerated economic decline. The current fragmentation within the European Union proves one thing. The illusion of a strong and united Europe is collapsing. This crisis is an opportunity for Africa to break free from neo-colonial chains and embrace a new era of sovereignty and economic independence. Even more, it paves the way for global peace by ending the European Union's automatic alignment with Washington's warmongering interests. If this division deepens, Europe will ultimately have to recognize that it has nothing to gain from an absurd war against Russia, and must return to balanced diplomacy. The world is changing, and this time, Africa will be on the right side of history. Chris Yapi does not lie. Find Chris Yapi on his 2 YouTube channels, his Rumble channel, his TikTok, X, Instagram, VK and Threads accounts.